If you look at the animation that we're creating, the animation can be divided up into 4 distinct sections. The first section, where the pie rises out of the ground. The second section, where the pie slides to the left of the screen. The third section, where the pie's values change. And the fourth section, where one piece of the pie grows out of the rest of the pie and is highlighted. Between those sections, there are long pauses as the text on the right side animates onto the screen. During those sections, the 3D elements are completely static. Because of this, we'll only focus on the sections as they move. We can determine the hold times for the static sections in After Effects. There's no reason to render duplicate frames. The default timeline in Layout is 60 frames. This isn't long enough for the effect that we're trying to achieve, so let's change it to 560. We can trim it back later if necessary. Let's start with the first section, where the pie grows out of the ground. Start by changing the morpher from 0 to -1. Remember, to use the slider's control, you need to activate the slider in the Modify panel. Changing the morpher to -1 will make the entire pie recede into the ground. Next, let's determine the value that we're going to use for our delayer object. This will determine the period of time in which it will take for each slice to follow the previous slice. Let's set it to 3 frames. Don't worry if the precision of the slider isn't exact. We can adjust that later in the graph editor if we need to. Now let's animate our first slice growing out of the ground. On slide 12, change the morpher's value from -1 to 0. If we scrub through the animation, you'll see that the effect is working as intended, but much of the effect in the first half is obscured by the pie. So let's go to frame 0, make sure the pie is selected, and let's change the rotation of the pie to -120 in the heading. Now if you scrub through the animation, you can see the pie perfectly in the first half, but it's obscured in the second half. So let's go to frame 320, right around the time when the effect ends, and let's keyframe the heading rotation to 36 degrees. Now if we scrub through it, we can see the entire effect as it's happening. The next part of the animation is the pie sliding to the left. Instead of animating the pie moving left, let's just animate the camera moving right. At frame 320, select the camera and set a keyframe. This will ensure that the camera remains stationary during the initial part of the animation when the pie is growing out of the ground. Next, go to frame 368 or 2 seconds after we just set our keyframe, and keyframe the camera to 100 meters in the x-axis. The next part of the animation is the section where the values shift. This section is animated entirely through the use of an animated texture map, so there's nothing for us to do yet, except blocking the time for that to happen. So let's move to frame 440. That gives us 3 seconds for the texture map to animate. And let's just set another camera keyframe, just to help us remember that time. The next part is the final piece of animation, when a 20% segment of the pie grows out of the pie and gets highlighted. To do this, we need the first 20 slices to grow out of the pie. If we were to animate the morpher control right now, all the pieces would follow just as they previously did. This is where our switch comes in. Keyframe the switch going from a value of 0 to 1 at frame 440. Remember to use the slider control. The sliders tool needs to be activated. After you've set that keyframe, the switch will now have two keyframes on it, one at frame 0 and one at frame 440. That means over the course of those 440 frames, the value will gradually change from 0 to 1, but we need the value to suddenly change at 440. To do this, open the graph editor, select the switch object, select its Y position channel, select the final keyframe, and change the incoming curve from the default TCB spline to stepped. If you zoom into the graph editor, what this will show is that the curve stays completely flat until frame 440 when it jumps to the value of 1. With the switch now turned on, we can manually keyframe each slice. But wouldn't it be nicer if we could still use the morpher control? This is easy to do. All we'll need to do is remove the on-off expressions from the first 20 slices and apply the grow-shrink expression to them. So open your graph editor, select the pie object, and on the first 20 morphs, remove the on-off expressions. So select morph 1 and on-off 1 and press remove, morph 2, on-off 2, remove, morph 3, on-off 3, remove, and so on. What this will do is make it so that our on-off switch no longer controls those 20 slices. So our morpher control will be able to control it throughout the entire animation. This takes away a little bit of the flexibility in the control, but allows us to finish our effect without manually keyframing things. Once you've removed all 20, we need to apply the first 20 grow shrinks to those same slices. So select morph number 1, grow shrink number 1, and press apply. Morph number 2, grow shrink number 2, apply, and so on. This will allow the grow shrink expression to be used throughout the entire animation instead of only when the switch is turned off. With that done, we can now use the morpher control to control those 20 slices. So let's move to frame 452. Be sure your sliders control is active, and change the morpher to -1. Excuse me, +1. Then let's go back to frame 440 and set the morpher to 0. Don't worry if it's not completely flush. That's just a problem in the graph header that we'll fix in the next section. Now if we scrub through the animation, you'll see that those 20 frames are still controlled with the delay by the expressions. Now let's tweak our curves to fix some of the problems that the sliders introduce and also to give our animation a little bit more character. Open up the graph editor and open the camera's channels. Select the camera's X position channel, which is the only one that we edited. And let's change the TCB values. Let's give it a tension of 1. This will add a little bit of ease out on the camera and give it a bit more character. Then let's move on to the delayer. The delayer only has one keyframe in the Y position axis, but that keyframe isn't set exactly at 3. It's currently set to 3.0078. So let's select that and just fix it. Next, let's do the morpher. The morpher also only has keyframes in the Y position channel. But if we look at it, the middle two keyframes have this weird S-curve in them when they need to be completely flat. So select the third keyframe and change its incoming curve from TCB spline to linear. Then let's select the second keyframe and increase its tension just like we did on the camera to give it a little bit of ease. Let's do the same thing with the fourth keyframe. Then let's just double check to make sure all our values are correct. The first keyframe should be at -1. Second keyframe should be at 0. The third keyframe should also be at 0, which it's not, so let's change it. And the fourth keyframe should be at 1. With that done, our animation has a little bit more pop. Also, with that, the animating of the scene is done. The next thing we'll be doing is texturing. To do that, we'll be using a combination of After Effects and Lightwave. To texture our pie chart, we'll be creating an animated texture map in After Effects. After we've created it, we'll apply it to our model in Lightwave. Then we'll be ready to render the finished 3D scene. To begin, create a new composition in After Effects. Set the resolution to 1024 by 1024. Frame rate should be 24 frames per second, and the duration should be 560 frames. Our texture map will be a circle mapped onto the pie in the y-axis, so let's start by making a circular shape. Let's duplicate that layer 3 times, giving us 4 shapes in total. Rename the bottom shape to something recognizable like Big Slice. The second one can be named Medium Slice. And the third, Small Slice. Name the top layer Lighting. Next, let's add some effects to our layers. Add the fill effect to all 3 slice layers. Then add the radial wipe effect to the medium and small slice layers. On the lighting layer, make sure its fill is set to gradient. Edit the gradient so it goes from light in the lower left to dark in the upper right. Change the blending mode of the layer to overlay. Select the big slice layer and change the parameters on the fill effect. Change the color to blue. On the medium layer, change the color to orange. And on the small slice, change the color to a deeper red. Then we'll change the parameters on the radial transitions. Select the medium slice and change the transition completion from 0 to 73. On the small slice, change it from 0 to 99. That should give you a blue slice that's 73% of the pie, an orange slice that's 26, and a red slice that's 1%. Back in Layout, we designated frames 368 to 440 as the frames where the values of our pie chart would change. So select the small slice layer and go to frame 368. At frame 368, keyframe the transition completion parameter under the radial wipe effect. Do the same thing for the medium slice. Now go to frame 440 and change the transition completion on the small slice to 80. On the medium slice, change it to 64. What we now have is a red slice that takes up 20% of the total pie, an orange slice that takes up 16%, and a blue slice that takes up 64%. In the next section of the animation, all of the slices except for the red slice fade back and the red slice is highlighted. So on frame 440, select the big slice and add a keyframe to the color value. Do the same thing to the medium slice. Now move to frame 520. And change the color on the medium slice to a medium gray. 180, 180, 180. Do the same thing with the big slice. After this is done, if you scrub through, you'll see that we start out with a static pie. Then the values of the pie shift, and finally, the two slices fade away to leave only the small slice. Now let's save our scene, then we can render out the frames to use in Lightwave. Let's render out the composition. I'm going to render them as a series of PNG files. Since PNG files are lossless but are compressed, they're a very good trade-off between image quality and file size. Once you're finished rendering the sequence, we'll be able to move to layout. Back in Layout, open the Surface Editor and select the Pi surface. Click on the T next to Color. This will enter the Texture Editor. Where it says Image None, press the arrow to bring up the drop-down and select Load Image. Find the images that you just rendered out of After Effects and load the first one. Then hit the Edit Image button and change the image type from Still to Sequence. Next, change the texture axis to Y and change the scale from 111 to 100.5 meters, 25 meters, and 100.5 meters. Change the rotation of the texture map to 270 degrees in the heading. Hit the Use Texture button, and we're all done applying the texture to the Pi. If we change our viewport display to Texture Shaded Solid and scrub through the animation, we can see the whole thing. The Pi starts out by growing out of the ground. After that, it moves to the left. Then the values of the Pi change. And after that, one of the slices grows out of the rest of the Pi and is highlighted. And that completes the 3D portion of this tutorial. All that's left is rendering our scene out. In our After Effects composition, we ended the animation at frame 520. So in Layout, let's trim our timeline back from 560 to 520. Now select the camera and open its properties. Change the anti-aliasing from 1 to 20. This will smooth out the shadows from the area light nicely. Under Motion Blur, let's turn on Photo Real Motion Blur. Leave the values at their defaults. Next, go to the Render tab and press Render Globals. In general, change the first field to 0 and the last field to 520. Then let's go to the Output tab. In the Output tab, check the box that says Save RGB. This will prompt you for a place to save your rendered frames. Let's save our frames as PNG files. Once all of this is done, all that's left is to render the scene. Before we do that, make sure you save the scene one last time. Also, make sure you save all the object files. Then press the Render Scene button and wait for it to complete. Once the rendering of the scene is complete, we can come back and finish the last part of the tutorial, compositing it all together in After Effects. In the final portion of the tutorial, we'll be putting the finishing touches on our scene in After Effects. Since this tutorial's focus was mostly Lightwave, I'm going to go pretty quickly through this part. Start by making a new composition. The new comp should be 1280 by 720 with square pixels. It should be 24 frames per second. Set the length of the composition to 1100 frames. After you've created the new composition, import our rendered frames into the footage bin. Be sure to import them as a ping sequence. After they've been imported, right-click on the entry and select Interpret Footage. In the Interpret Footage dialog, change the frame rate from 30 to 24. Once that's done, drag your frames into the comp. In the final animation, we have several sections where the animation pauses as the text animates on and off. Let's set up those pauses now. Start by selecting the footage in the timeline, then go to Layer, Time, and enable Time Remapping. Time remapping will allow us to slow down, speed up, stop, or reverse time. Because we can pause time or reverse time, it also allows us to drag the length of the footage longer than the 520 frames. So let's drag it out to the end of the comp. Now let's set up keyframes that will determine when the action pauses. 2 keyframes are set up by default. The first one is set up at frame 0 with a value of 0. Leave that one where it is. Second keyframe should be at frame 24. And should also have a value of 0. This will create a pause at the beginning of the animation. A third keyframe should be set at frame 401, and the value should be 368. This will resume time normally between 24 and 401. The next keyframe should be 641. At frame 641, and should have a value of 368 also. This will create a pause between the previous keyframe and this keyframe. The next keyframe should be at frame 713 and should have a value of 440. This will allow time to flow normally again between those 2 keyframes. The next keyframe should be at frame 833 and should also have a value of 440. This will create another pause. And the last keyframe should be at frame 914 and should have a value of 521, which is the last frame of the animation. If we look at the graph editor, you'll see more clearly what happened. In these flat areas, time is paused. it's just holding on a single frame. And then in these angled areas, time is resuming normally. If you look in the info box, you can see how fast time is going at any given point. Here at frame 879, time is flowing at 1 second per second, so normal time. But if we go to frame 794, time is flowing at 0 seconds per second, or it's frozen. Let's create a RAM preview to make sure it worked. You'll see during this section, time is flowing normally, but once it hits this keyframe, time should pause. Perfect. Now when it hits this keyframe, time will resume again, but then when it hits this one, time will pause again. Everything seems to be working exactly as it should. Now let's add an adjustment layer above our rendered frames. On that adjustment layer, we're going to add two effects, a vignette and some color correction. In the effects and presets in the search box, start typing the word vignette. There should be a preset called vignette lighting. Drag that onto the adjustment layer. Then, let's add color balance. And drag that onto the adjustment layer. In the color balance, let's change the settings to the following. Change the midtone red to 15, the midtone green to 20, and the midtone blue to 35. This will add a slight adjustment to our layer, as well as the vignette effect. Now we can start creating the elements that will animate on and off on the right hand side of the screen. Let's start by creating our rounded rectangles, which are going to serve as our legend. Add a new shape layer, and make it a rounded rectangle. For the fill, make sure the fill is set to radial gradient with opacity of 100%. Edit that gradient so that it's dark blue on the outside and a lighter blue on the inside. Rename that layer to blue. Then let's duplicate that layer. Rename the new one to yellow and edit its fill. The dark blue should become a darker yellow. And the light blue should become a lighter yellow. Now duplicate that layer and call the new one red. And adjust its fill. With those three shapes created, position them equidistant apart on the right hand side of the screen. While we're at it, let's create one more shape layer. Make this one a rectangle and have it cover approximately 40% of the screen on the right. Change its fill type from gradient to solid. Make it a white color. And change the opacity to 50%. Let's move this layer below the adjustment layer. Now let's create our text elements. Start by making a text layer and type in the words fruit popularity. I'm using the font Trade Gothic, bold, with a size of 60. Don't worry about the positioning for now. Then let's duplicate that layer and change the text to say blueberries. Decrease the font size from 60 down to 24. Again, for now, don't worry about where it's positioned. 24 looks a little bit small, so let's go up to 32. Duplicate that layer and change to bananas. And one more time for cherries. Now let's duplicate each of those layers to create the percentages. Duplicate blueberries, and the first blueberry percentage is 73%. Let's increase the size from 32 to 40, maybe 44. Then let's duplicate that text. And change it from 73 to 26. Duplicate that and change it from 26 to 1%. But there's also the part of the animation where the values change. Right around here. So we need to duplicate each of those numbers and change them. Duplicate the 73 and change that one to 64. Duplicate the 26 and change that one to 16. And duplicate the 01 and change it to 20. The only other piece of text we need is our final takeaway text that's going to appear when we highlight the red frame. Let's create that by duplicating the fruit popularity layer. And let's change the text to the following. This will be some nonsensical quote, like cheap prices coupled with an increase in cherry production assures that cherries will gain ground in the fruit market. With all of our text elements created, all that's left is to animate each of them and to align everything. Before we start animating our elements, let's line everything up. This portion of the tutorial is pretty subjective based on your tastes, so I'm just going to talk as I do it. I'm not going to give you any hard numbers though. To start off with, let's align our title and our legend elements. Then let's align all of our labels and percentages. And finally, let's line each of those up with their legend pieces. And let's hide everything so that we can see our takeaway quote. And let's align that as well. Once everything is aligned in the scene the way you'd like it to be, we can begin animating. With everything all aligned, we can begin animating our elements. We're going to animate this very simply, using nothing but opacity keyframes. You're free to go a bit crazier with the text animation and such, but since the focus of this tutorial was primarily Lightwave, we're just going to do this pretty simply. Let's start by animating our white box. It's going to come on as our pie is sliding from the center over to the left. The pie starts sliding around frame 360. So at 360, let's set an opacity keyframe on our white box layer with a value of 0. Then, as the pie reaches its endpoint at about frame 400, let's set another keyframe at 100%. After the white box has appeared, we want to animate on the title and the 3 legend boxes. Let's stagger that animation a little bit with the white box. So go back half a second to frame 388. And set keyframes for the legend boxes and the title in their opacity channel with a value of 0. Then go forward 1 second to frame 412 and change the values of their opacity to 100. After those have appeared, let's animate on the labels: blueberries, bananas, and cherries. Stagger those a little as well, so go to frame 400 and set opacity keyframes with a value of 0. Then go to frame 424 1 second later and set the values to 100. Then let's animate on our 3 initial percentages: 73%, 26%, and 1%. At frame 412, let's set opacity keyframes with a value of 0. And then at frame 436, 1 second later, let's set the values to 100. Then if we scrub forward to about frame 640, that's where the values of the pie are going to shift. And that ends around frame 730. So at frame 700, let's set opacity keyframes for the 3 initial percentages, 73, 26, and 1, at 100. And then at 724, let's set them at 0, so that they'll animate off of the scene. Then, back at frame 712, let's set opacity keyframes for our 3 final percentages, 64, 16, and 20. Set them with a value of 0, and then at frame 736, set them to a value of 100. So as the pie is shifting its values, the percentages will change. The next thing is to have everything animate off so that the quote can animate on. The red pie, red slice, starts getting highlighted around frame 835 and ends around frame 920. So at frame 900, let's select everything: the 3 legend items, the title, the labels, and the final percentages. And let's set opacity keyframes on them. Then let's go forward 1 second to 924 and change their values to 0. At frame 912, let's set a keyframe on our quote with a value of 0. And then at 936, let's set the value to 100. Let's watch a RAM preview of the whole thing, but if everything went well, the animation should be done. This looks pretty good to me, and that concludes this tutorial. All that's left is for you to render out your comp. With it all rendered out, let's watch our final effect one more time. That ends this tutorial. Hopefully you guys had fun watching it. I surely had fun making it. Thanks to everyone who did watch it, and thanks to CG Tuts Plus for allowing me to create it.